Good evening, everyone. This is a policy subcommittee meeting of the school committee. We have 8 items on our agenda today, so we might as well get started. The first agenda item is review approval of the minutes of the March 22nd policy review subcommittee meeting. Have subcommittee members had an opportunity to review the minutes? Yes, would someone like to move them?
I'll move them.
Thank you, Andy. Is there a second? I'll second. Andy, your vote?
Yes.
Jennifer?
Abstain. I was not present for the meeting.
And I also vote yes. All right, next up is a discussion of recent racist incidents in the PSB and how policy could be used as one of several tools to address them. In looking through our policy handbook, I found that we already have 5 policies that address some of the issues that we discussed during our emergency school committee meeting, as well as in other instances where we've had racist and anti-Semitic incidents. And these policies include the policy against discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, and retaliation, the bullying prevention policy, the prohibition of hazing, the student code of conduct, and student rights and responsibilities. Now, the reason that I docketed this for today was that we had yet another racist incident at the high school recently, and there has been a lot of conversation in the community around whether our policies sufficiently safeguard against some of these incidents and what type of work we could undertake in policy to perhaps strengthen them if necessary. So what I'm hoping we can discuss today is whether we think we need to make changes to how the policies are written, if we feel that we need to develop better procedures to further the initiatives and objectives laid out by the policies, to what extent is the issue follow through on policy, and to what extent is the policy itself. So what are your thoughts? Do we feel that the policies as written are fine and that it's more that we need to be clear on the procedures that are promulgated in furtherance of these policies? Or are there specific policies that we think we should reopen for revision? I see that we have Connie Claussen in attendance as an attendee. Connie, if you have any thoughts on this, you're more than welcome to join the discussion. Thank you, Robin. Could you add Ms. Claussen?
Hi, thank you. My name is Connie Claussen, and I am a Brookline out-of-district parent. My thoughts, David, I wasn't prepared to speak. I wasn't sure I was be able to make it tonight. My thoughts are that policies are adequate. I think that it's the procedures and the way that they are being implemented are the problem. I think a lot of it really came through very clearly in the special education review project, where people are perceived that investigations are not reliable. And I think that we need to change that perception. However that may be, I'm not sure that it is necessarily accurate across the schools, but it is a perception, and it's a very persistent perception in the community, and we need to address that. I also feel like for kids who are doubly or triply marginalized, a student of color who also has a disability, who may also have a language barrier, are very, very vulnerable populations. And I'm not really seeing supports put in place to address those kind of the intersectionality of their needs. And then my final thought is laws and procedures and just kind of general knowledge about cyberbullying have advanced exponentially over the last 5 years, but it still is a persistent, significant problem, especially among middle school kids. They're on social media and they don't know how to handle it. And over I hear from parents that I talk to, because I am a resource for cyberbullying, and over I hear from parents that I talk to that the response from the schools is, well, just take their phone away. And we need a better plan, and that's not policy and that's not procedure. It's just more education and knowledge, but we need more wraparound care where we're connecting with families, where we're involving families in this conversation, and we are helping the kids to manage their social media, because it's out there, it's a part of their lives, it's not going away. And we need to be partnering with community organizations and families on helping them manage it. So thank you.
David, you're on mute.
Does anyone else have anything that they would like to comment on in connection to this agenda item?
Yes, so I agree with Connie that procedure and implementation of procedure and training on procedure seems to be a big piece of this. I looked at the policies, and David, this committee, not that long ago, redid significant portions or policies in full on most all of them. I think when I looked at the dates, they're pretty encompassing. I think the biggest challenge is that we've had a lot of central admin turnover in the times since those policies were updated. And I'm unclear. I tried to do a search for them. I couldn't find all the procedures. So I'm not actually even certain that we have procedures for all of the pieces where we indicate a procedure will be implemented in a policy. So, and that's not on Dr. Guillory, that's on just a lot of transition over the last couple of years in central office. And so I guess I'm wondering whether a place to start would be to inventory all the procedures that are linked to them, and then make sure that we actually have a procedure for all, and then go through those pieces, perhaps with central admin. I think the policies themselves are fairly strong, but the implementation piece, one, feels uneven, and two, I'm not quite sure that we've followed through. Like, for instance, restorative justice, I found a press release in 2019, I think it was, and Casey was very new to her role, I think in 2019, and she was listed as the contact. And then I don't think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think it was ever then implemented in the way that it was intended. Superintendent Bott stepped down, and then there were a series of leadership changes, and I don't think that was ever pursued. That's just an example that I found when I was going through them, and I'm sure that there are more that I didn't catch.
All right, I do think that's an excellent idea that we index the procedures for each corresponding policy. For one, that creates greater transparency for the public, and for two, we would then gain a better understanding as to where there might be some current cracks and deficiencies that we could work to ameliorate. Any other thoughts from subcommittee members or anyone else? All right, so in preparation for our next meeting, hopefully we can have someone from central office on who can comment on the status of procedures for each of these policies. And beyond that, hopefully we can review the procedures that exist for each of these policies. And to the extent that some of these policies may not have procedures, we would certainly want to encourage district leadership to promulgate corresponding procedures. So the next item on our agenda is discussing the creation of a policy on school improvement plans. This was added to the agenda at the request of Dr. Guillory. I think the reason he wanted to discuss this was because we had recent presentations on school improvement plans, and we may want to review how those plans are crafted and whether those presentations were sufficiently enlightening for us, or what the positives were, perhaps the negatives, and how we would like to move forward with school improvement plans. Do subcommittee members have any thoughts on that?
I think I just have a clarifying question.
Yes.
Was his intent to try to have a uniform policy, or what? I guess what was the intent behind?
I believe his intent was to have a uniform policy, although I'm not sure. Hopefully he signs back in again and we can find out.
Okay. That just seems to go against the piece of what's stated anyway as being a unique culture for each school. I thought it was a piece of how we've always spoken about them, but.
Well, I don't think there's necessarily an inherent conflict there. So a policy can say just that each school should develop a unique culture to it and school-specific goals. So a policy can lay that out. But I agree with you. We would want to hear further from Dr. Guillory about his thoughts on this. Jennifer?
I was just going to sort of, I might be repeating you. I think that the policy, I would like to hear more from Dr. Guillory about what he had in mind for what the policy might be or do. I need to understand more what the purpose of the policy would be, what the goals of the policy would be. Because the school SIPs or school improvement plans typically may have common goals to serve as a way for schools to harness, to set goals for themselves. Those goals can be different. They don't necessarily have to be around, like MCAS per se. They suit the needs of the school, and those needs may be different for each school. So I don't think that they need to be uniform. I think to your point, Val, I think that they have very, very different purposes and goals. I mean, have very different purposes and meet different needs is what I mean to say. I'm just wondering what the district's needs may be around a policy. And so I'd like to hear more from the district around what the needs of the district are in order for us to understand what we might be crafting in terms of a policy. So I don't know how I feel about it because I don't think I understand what the need is.
Andy?
Yeah, so I see that we already have a policy on school councils that has a paragraph on SIPs and another paragraph on school committee oversight, which talks about presentation of SIP to school committee. So that would be a natural place to start if we think that something needs revision. I mean, just looking at these two paragraphs, they don't, to me, cry out for revision. Unless we really are intending to sort of get much deeper into SIPs than we have been.
Suzanne?
Yeah, I'm just wondering if it would be helpful for us to have a policy a little bit around the timeline. We've been kind of all over the place when we expect to see them. And I think if maybe we could have a conversation with Dr. Guillory about when it would be most helpful to the school committee and to central office to review them and support. And I don't actually know what the answer is, but each year we seem to do it kind of haphazardly in a different way. It might be helpful if we said, we expect to see them in November for that school year, or we'd like to see them in June for the following school year. I mean, I'm not sure when that is, but if we could get ourselves on a schedule, it might be helpful to everybody.
I agree with you, Suzanne. I think it would be helpful if we developed a timeline and it was more predictable when the SIPs would be rolled out, when they would be reviewed, when they would be presented to school committee. Jennifer? You're on mute.
That would be helpful, I think, for us as a committee would be to know. I think it could even be helpful for us to have them in the spring to know what's coming up for the purposes of schools planning, to know what the year ahead is going to bring, so that they may plan their PD for the year ahead. They may plan, for a whatever the goals are for the year ahead, that whatever the schedule is, knowing what the schedule would be helpful to us as a committee, maybe helpful to schools to get on a plan, a cycle, whatever that cycle is, whatever the district thinks is good. I could see that being helpful. I also think a format would be helpful. So this time, principals came to us. In years past, we've gone into the schools to school councils, and that was really enjoyable, quite frankly, going into the schools and attending school councils. So that would be helpful to maybe set up, if there's some way to put those sort of parameters into a policy, or to codify it in some way, or that might be helpful. So a format, a schedule, those would be helpful things, I think, to know. Trying to think, there was maybe one other thing. I don't know, but maybe it's helpful to have a number of goals so that principals don't feel overwhelmed with the number of tasks that we ask of them. I don't know. I don't want to limit them. I don't want to limit, but I also don't want people to feel overwhelmed, There was something else I had in mind, but it's escaped me.
All right, anyone else like to comment on school improvement plans and a potential policy regarding them? I will say to Andy's point that we already have a logical place to start, which is the existing school site council policy. So potentially any changes that we're discussing today and at future meetings could be an outgrowth of that existing policy, and maybe go into that policy so that we avoid duplication. Because right now, a broader problem that we have with the policy handbook is there does tend to be some repetition and topics that are covered in sometimes even 3 or 4 different policies, whereas you really only need one in order to cover it. So I would rather avoid creating a standalone policy if it's not absolutely necessary. Jennifer?
I agree with you completely. And the only other comment I have is that I would prefer that we not do so many schools at once, because it's overwhelming. And it's really hard to give schools the attention that they really deserve in preparing those presentations and really being able to dive into getting to know each individual school. So I would put forward that I would prefer maybe no more than 2 schools in one night. That's why I think going to the school council meetings, because we could really sit and really understand the goals of individual schools when we went to the schools. It was just overwhelming. We sort of powered through them, and I'm glad that we did meet with the schools this year, and we did get to do the SIPs this year, but I would just prefer not to do so many in one night.
All right, Valerie?
On the piece about policies and how many we have, I think that yes, where we can, we should do that. But I'm also wondering about whether there's a more logical way for us to order some of them. Thinking back, I'm going back now to agenda item 1, I guess. Some of the instances that happened at the high school, I would say, involved both the discrimination policy, the bullying policy, and the code of conduct. But if somebody doesn't know that all 3 of those exist and are reading them together, it's hard to, I think that's why for the public, it's often hard to understand that we actually do have policy that covers cyberbullying and discrimination based on protected class, as well as a code of conduct, right? And so I don't know the answer. I'm just raising it as something that you almost have to read all 3 of those in one to come up with the solution in a particular case, in a particular instance, right? And so we may know that as a policy committee, and this isn't something I have an answer to. I'm just raising it as something that based on specific instances that we've had at the high school very recently, there have been at least 3, sometimes more, policies that would apply to a situation that I think should be standalone, because they aren't always, right? They don't always go together, and so I don't know if that's a training issue or how that would work. I'm just putting it out there for discussion.
Does that make sense? Anyone else have points that they would like to make? regarding this agenda item or any of the earlier ones? All right, then that moves us on to item number 4, discussion of the general school administration policy. And here we have a very specific draft to look at. Also included in your materials, the MASC template version, which, as you've seen, is very general, does not really offer any kind of specificity. It's only 5 paragraphs for the 2 sections that are worked on in the draft policy that I submitted. Our current draft does delineate the different positions that are in senior leadership, but clearly, having been last passed in 1984, the titles no longer are aligned with the titles we use today. And beyond that, we now have additional positions that are considered to be at a senior level. And those positions include Senior Director of Equity and Senior Director of Data and Strategy. So in this draft that I worked on off of the existing policy, I substituted the words for the titles that we use currently. I also added the positions for Senior Director of Equity and Senior Director of Data and Strategy. The descriptions that I added were largely based from the school department website, which includes descriptions for these positions. I also removed head of school from the central office and senior cabinet list, as that didn't really seem like the right place for a principal. There's another section that describes sort of a building-based leadership, and I think head of school likely belongs there. Any initial thoughts to changes in this draft? And that would be for section 3 of the general school administration. Then for section 7, there's some more changes made. Under section 7, there were certain responsibilities that the superintendent has for presentations to school committee on an annual basis, a quarterly basis, and a monthly basis. And I felt that some of those responsibilities were obsolete, that others were not practical, and that there were some which were missing, where recent policies that we passed required some fairly robust level of reporting, including an annual report by the penultimate school committee meeting. So I added those into the section regarding annual reports. But I think this is also a good place to discuss whether there's any other information that we would like to have reported to us on an annual basis that we feel should be spelled out in the policy, or also on a quarterly basis or even a monthly basis. Although I took out the section for monthly because that seems perhaps a bit overwhelming from a work perspective. Any thoughts about any portion of this draft? Jennifer?
As always, David, you have incredible initiative. You do a huge heavy lift for the committee. I'll say for myself. I think it's amazing the amount of work in. So I know the amount that of work you've put into drafting these. So I just want to say thank you. I thought this was great. I was like, yes. This is something we've talked about. The reporting out to the full school committee. I was like, yes, and this one, oh yes, and he put this in there too. So I was having trouble coming up with other things, and I was like, oh, I wonder if, of course, if we think of something, we can always come back. I couldn't think of any other things that we needed to put in here. Of course, at some later date, I might remember, but at this time, I couldn't think of other additional items that need to go on here. I will probably remember when we've already put this forward to the full school committee or at another date. But this was a really great list of things that we have been asking for, or we needed to remember to update this policy. So this was great. So I just want to say thank you for gathering this and coming back to this and adding these. So, and I did think that there were some things in here that did need to be taken out. I think monthly reporting is clearly too frequent. There were things in here that I agreed. I thought you took them out. I think they were appropriate. That was asking for too much. The workload of the superintendent and of district staff is too heavy to be asking for some of this frequent reporting. So I thought it was appropriate, the things you took out. And there are some things that do need to be reported to us that I don't think we're getting yet, or that we just aren't, that aren't frequent enough. And I just like that it was organized in one place. So thank you for doing this work. Like I said, there may be things I'm not thinking of that we do need to add, but I couldn't come up with them at the time. So thank you. That was a very long-winded thank you.
Very welcome. Andy?
Yeah, I mean, I have a few comments on just detail and wording, which I think this is probably not the meeting to raise them. I do have one sort of more substantive question about the two items that are supposed to be reported quarterly. One is a report on the budget status for a given fiscal year, and the other is budget expenditures and remaining balance for the given fiscal year. What's the difference between those? Like the reports that we've been getting from Sam about the current fiscal year are right, that they're pretty all encompassing.
Yes.
Unless you're also talking about budget development for the next fiscal year, where we end up getting reports far more often than quarterly, once budget season rolls around.
Well, that's not what I was intending, but I do think that's important. So budget development for the following fiscal year, I'll add that in.
Although I'm not sure that's so much of a quarterly report. It just gets really intense at a certain season.
It could be a generic update though, of even a sentence or two. Then it's not necessarily a heavy lift, because we do want to engage, I think, in longer term strategic planning. Mm-hmm. And that certainly involves constantly preparing for the year beyond, not just putting out current fires. But what I was really going for with number 2 and quarterly was the remaining balance for a given fiscal year part. So in a general budget status update, we might not get that second piece about how much money we have left. And I think that's probably worth knowing, because in past years, it hasn't happened this year or even last year, but I do recall 2 years ago, there was very much an open question as to how much money we had left. And we were heading into the final month of the fiscal year without knowing whether we could balance our budget as statutorily required. And we were trying to find conceivably very drastic ways in order to make sure we had that balanced budget in that last month. So if we had quarterly updates on how much money is left in a given fiscal year, that might avoid that problem, or we would address it sooner.
So the budget updates were telling us how much had been spent, but not how much remained.
Right.
Oh.
I don't think we usually get updated on how much remains. Jennifer?
I was gonna say, we used to get memos. We used to get quarterly memos. We could probably go back. Robin might be able to pull those up. I'm not on finance, but we used to get them at full school committee. I don't know if those still get issued to finance, and I don't know, is anyone here on finance?
No, but I was there at the last meeting, and he did do like a year to date.
So I suspect Sam probably does still issue those. So maybe we could just, we could get those to full school committee. I'm sure he has that information. So maybe we could just bubble that up to full school committee. I'm sure he issues those. I'm sure he has that information. So maybe we could just have that pull up to the full docket and just have that into the format of like a formalized memo. It used to come in the form of a memo, and it would have what's been spent and what remains, like what the budget, what the gap may or may not be. And then in it, there would be a section in the memo that would say where there may, or what the deficit or the gap may or may not be, and where the savings may or may not be able to be captured. So there would be like a numbers section, and then sort of like like a text section with discussion. So that was helpful. And there would be like updates to the full committee. You know what I'm talking about, right, David?
Yes. So one possibility would be to merge the first 2 points under quarterly. So something like, say, a report on the budget status for a given fiscal year, comma, including budget expenditures and remaining balance. Something like that would cover it, I think.
And David, I had a question. Thank you for putting this draft together. I didn't see bullying reports on there. Did I just miss it?
I put complaints of violations pursuant to the code of conduct, but we, yes, could add that because bullying's a separate policy.
Oh, yeah, that definitely, I thought that was on there. Because harassment's on there, bullying should be on there.
All right, so I'll add that as another requirement for annual reporting.
Can you just not add that to 8? Which is complaints of violation pursuant to PSB policy against discrimination, harassment, sexual harassment, and retaliation. Is that
It's a separate policy, so I could put and
okay?
bullying prevention policy under
Okay.
8. All right. Andy, you said you had some specific word choice issues. I actually think we might as well do it. Maybe we could even move this.
I think unless you really, I mean, they're very minor, so I don't want to take up people's time at this stage. Seriously.
All right.
I guess, well, I'll raise one because it's a little bit more substantive, is where the senior director of data and strategy is described as the chief of staff to the superintendent. And maybe that says that on the website. I really have no idea what that means.
That's what it says on the website, so I just went with it.
Okay.
Now, a question I had in these descriptions was for regarding deputy superintendents for student services. Shall manage all counseling, psychological, and special education services to individual students, making use of mainstreaming and general education facilities. Is mainstreaming still the proper term here, or should that be updated?
We probably nowadays use the word inclusion, right, to express that concept.
Yes.
Yeah, you're right, Andy. Inclusion is the word, I think.
But I was thinking about inclusion as well, but do we call it inclusion facilities? That doesn't sound right. And yet the second part of that is general education facilities. So making use of. How should we reword that to include inclusion?
Can we just say something like utilizing general education facilities, so all students, or what, like, what are we trying to say? What do we get? I'm just not sure what we're getting at there. Managing all counseling, psychological, and special education services to individual students and utilizing general education facilities, because gen ed, the facilities are for all students. So all students are provided with optimal academic and personal benefits from their school experiences.
I mean, I think what we're talking about is collaborating with general education to facilitate inclusion. Right?
So maybe state that explicitly. So, and utilizing general educational facilities to
Facilitate inclusion, or
facilitate.
what do you think,
Can we
Andy?
just call them educational facilities? That
Yeah,
promote
or-
inclusion for all, like calling out the general piece
Yeah.
sounds strange to me in that context.
I mean, I guess concretely, to me, it means that the person in that role, needs to be in constant touch with people whose responsibilities are mainly gen ed, right? And needs to make sure that people in their office do the same with, people at the appropriate level, in order to facilitate inclusion overall. So it's not really about making use of facilities. It's
But then the
about
word,
making,
right, and the word
it's about making
facility.
sure that, I don't like the word facilities. It sounds like, bathrooms or something, and it's more than that. We're talking about knocking heads together and getting people to collaborate.
So then it's collaborating with maybe like OTL, or collaborating with whatever. It's not about the buildings, it's about the people.
Right.
about the kids. It's about the.
That's how I
adults.
envision it anyway. That may not be the intent of whoever drafted this.
Well, it's our draft now.
So, and collaborating with,
Collaborating with, well, I don't know, with school administration, well, whatever, I don't know, the administration organization with central office and senior cabinet, I don't know. Who are we asking them to collaborate with? Specifically, the deputy superintendent of teaching and learning with the superintendent? I don't know. What are we saying?
I think with school administration, want to be a bit broader, because what this is really getting at, this role is essentially in charge of special education, even though we're not explicitly stating that. And that deals with more than just senior cabinet. So I think collaborating with school administration to facilitate inclusion.
Should we be more explicit and say collaborating with, others in central office as well as building-based administration?
Collaborating.
Andy, you got me stuck on chief of staff. I'm like, I gotta look and I'm like, chief
Yeah,
of
I mean, but
staff?
my only way to think about that is the White House chief of
Yeah.
staff, and that just does not seem like the role that
I know,
our
Linus
data
is
person
back. You should
plays.
ask him. Do you have a chief of staff, Linus?
We don't really use that language.
Is that your son?
Chief of
Or-
staff.
Okay.
What did he say? I'm sorry. I think I spoke over him.
He
What
said
did-
he didn't have one. He doesn't have one, so.
All right, so I guess the website should change. All right, so the deputy superintendent for special services shall manage all counseling, psychological, and special education services to individual students and collaborate with others in central office and building-based administration to promote inclusion so that all students are provided with optimal academic and personal benefits from their school experiences.
It's student services though, right? Not special services?
Right, student services.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
Seems like an improvement.
Okay.
Yeah.
And now going back to Senior Director of Data and Strategy. So we're going to remove Chief of Staff to Superintendent. Any other changes? So one other one is that we call it Senior Director of Equity, Senior Director of Data and Strategy. But for human resources, it's just Director of Human Resources. But that might be a website issue, not necessarily official title. I would rather be consistent. Either they're all director or they're all senior director. Otherwise, it implies that one is higher than the other. And I think these are all supposed to be considered equivalents.
Well, one way to think about it is their salaries, I don't believe it's a senior director position of data and strategy, but I could be wrong in terms of how we pay.
So at least on the website, it's called Senior Director, but that, that doesn't mean that it's accurate, because we already found at least one inaccuracy where it's on the website, the Senior Director of Data and Strategy is listed as being Chief of Staff to the Superintendent.
That was probably when Ben was there, Lummis. I think that was his title, but I think the job changed a little bit when Aaron came in play. Anyway, it needs probably to be looked at. I don't think that that's what we have right now, so.
All right, so do you think we should push this off to our next meeting and have staff look this over and adjust the descriptions accordingly?
I think it would be worthwhile to have each cabinet member see whether the description of their job actually matches their job, yes.
Right. All right, any other thoughts for today's discussion on this policy? No? Okay, now that we have Dr. Guillory back, I'd like to move backwards for a moment, back to the discussion of a policy on school improvement plans. Dr. Guillory, you asked that this be added to the agenda, and school committee members were wondering what specifically you had in mind.
Yes, so this year, one of the ask was for us to start looking at school improvement plans, because that's been something that hasn't happened in recent times. So this year we did sort of an accelerated push to bring those up. In most Massachusetts, I think, districts, there's a timeline schedule that's appropriated to school improvement plans at the timing of when those come up to school committee. So this was, I think.
Peter, son, can you come here?
So I think it's looking at a timeline aspect of when these items should be coming up. So it's a look at our current policy and saying, how does it need to be refreshed to be current is essentially what this would do.
All right, any questions from subcommittee members? No? Okay. We had discussed earlier in this context about revising the existing policy on school site councils, which does include a section about school improvement plans, to use that as a starting point. Suzanne brought up that it would be helpful to develop a more concrete timeline for SIPs and how they're developed and the schedule in which they are presented. All right, so now moving to our next agenda item, discussion of sustainability policy draft. In your materials for today, you have two different drafts. One of them was written by Wendy Stahl, who is with us. And Robin, if you could promote Ms. Stahl to panelist. And the other one is my attempt to integrate some of what Ms. Stahl wrote into the previous draft we had. Now, a primary difference that you will notice is that my draft is a bit softer on the requirements. And that was very much intentional because of the concern of creating unfunded mandates. Because when we have a policy for something, and then we don't live up to it, that can get us into some trouble for obvious reasons, because people look at these policies to help set their expectations for what we will do. So some of what you were seeking, Wendy, I certainly agree with on a personal level, but I'm not sure that the schools can make those pledges, because some of them might include significant financial resources that we may not, that we don't have right now and probably won't have in the near future. But I certainly think that they're important benchmarks that we could aspire to. And to the extent that this policy is aspirational and creating goals for us to achieve and certain milestones, it's useful to have some more detail, such as was present in the transportation section, as you and some others noted. So now I'll ask subcommittee members what your thoughts are on these two drafts and how you'd like to proceed. Andy.
Well, this isn't very exciting, but I didn't receive the drafts until very shortly before the meeting. So what I would like most is more time to actually read through them and compare and think about it. I'm sorry, I don't have anything more substantive right now.
All right, anyone else? Now, the sustainability policy was already referred to full school committee, but we're continuing to do work on it at the subcommittee level. So unless others have thoughts, we may just have to continue push this over into next month. But Wendy, why don't you go ahead and tell us about the impetus for your draft?
Hi, thanks for having me. I think that we're at the time where we can't afford to do anything the way that it used to be done. And schools are this wonderful opportunity where we get to actually teach the next generation. And Brookline is a very forward-thinking community. I think a lot of us really appreciate that about this town. The schools, we can't teach the kids the right thing about the climate unless we're really walking the walk. You know, teaching them about climate without having their schools be acting the way that we expect the whole world to be acting, with our buildings and our grounds actually being supportive of a climate future. I mean, it seems false. And I understand completely that there's a limit to the funding. Obviously, if unfunded mandates are very frustrating, but I think that there's a way to make it so that these aren't unfunded mandates, but rather very clear goals, not mandates, but goals that we're working towards. So if I did provide an extreme amount of specificity in my proposed draft, but that it doesn't have to be that way. It could be our goal is aligned with the town's goal of 0 emissions by 2040. And the details of how to get there would be, you know, hashed out in the day-to-day decisions that the school committee and the capital improvement plan requires. You know, like if you have the goal of 0 emissions by 2040, then that means that every appliance that you put into the buildings can't increase fossil fuel emissions. You know, I think there's a way to make it so that it's not necessarily like you mandate exactly how the building is running, but instead you mandate that every decision has to keep that in mind. So I just didn't want this opportunity to be wasted to like have a sustainability policy that doesn't actually give us that pie in the sky dream goal. Like, we know what needs to happen. Like, we need to stop burning fossil fuels. We need to stop chopping down our natural environment, and we need to educate our children about how to live in the future. Like, that's all we know that needs to be done. So I just wanted a policy that expressly says that every decision the schools will make will have that in mind.
All right, thank you very much. And for also your diligence and hard work in putting together this draft, which had so many useful goals to set, most of which have been incorporated into this other draft. And we'll continue this discussion moving forward. So thank you very much.
I just say go as far as you can go, really. Push the envelope. Brookline can lead the country with our school policy. I mean, really, we have this opportunity. So anyhow, thank you. Enjoy your meeting.
Any other comments from school committee members? Jennifer.
So one, I'm like, so just sitting here mortified. I'm sorry for my outburst, calling my son to come and take the dog who was bothering me. So I'm sorry. Totally mortified. Very unprofessional. Secondly, there's a ton of detail in here that wasn't in here before. So I, like Andy, would really appreciate some time to like really dive into the details, because there's a lot of detail. So I appreciate the level of specificity. And I'm wondering how much level of detail, as a fellow environmental enthusiast myself, the committee will endure. So I'm just wondering how far this envelope will go. And so, because there is, so I'm wondering how the language can be altered perhaps to make it a goal, as opposed to feeling for some, I think they will see part of this as a mandate. And so some things I think could be a mandate, and some things I think could be, I think we can afford to mandate some things, or to strongly encourage. I think we can, but I guess what I'm saying is I think we can do some of this and are doing some of it. And some of it I think is going to be tougher, like planning for emergency sheltering to provide resiliency for the broader community during extreme weather events or grid outages. That's going to be really tough for us to, to financially burden during these times. Is that a goal? Could we even have the physical space for that? Like, I don't even know what that involves. That's not my expertise area. I don't know what the financial implications of that are. I don't even know who would know that. I don't even know who I could ask. Do I want to do that? Sure. Yes. And do we have space? We have buildings that wouldn't be used during that time, right? That maybe we could use. I don't even know what all of that entails. So I don't know how we can manage this within this policy, David. I don't know how to say yes to all the things I want to say yes to. So I guess I'm wondering, as chair of the subcommittee, how do we move forward with this work, with this body of work? What are our next steps? How do we move forward on this? So I guess I have more questions than answers.
I personally am comfortable with having greater detail, but I agree with you that there's a tricky balance with detail and maneuverability, and whether the full committee would be willing to accept the specificity that's laid out in these goals. What I envision, though, is given that this draft was provided only a few hours before today's meeting, probably going to need to discuss this again at the subsequent meeting, at which point there will have been about a month to review it. And at that meeting, I think we'll have further clarity about whether we want to proceed with this degree of specificity, or if that's something that would be laid out in a set of accompanying procedures. I personally am inclined to lean toward having the detail that's built in. I think that our central office is stretched too thin as it is. And there are a lot of other policies that I think they are already working on developing procedures for. And if they're not, frankly, probably should be developing procedures for. So to the extent that we can help them out by having everything present in a policy, I think that would be the way to go. Given that it's aspirational and we're trying to frame it around goals rather than unfunded mandates, I think having more detail is fine. It's not something that would necessarily impact the day-to-day workload of our staff. In terms of scope, I like the current structure of the policy that we have. And I just want to bring this back to what the impetus was for developing this policy, which is we had a presentation at a full school committee meeting from several high school students who are very motivated to have some kind of policy on sustainability, which amazingly we don't currently have that, even though for the past several years, if not a decade, there has been significant interest in climate action in the school system. We've had programs that were developed around composting, for instance, that were recent, and there's more and more work being done in sustainability, but no clear, cohesive policy statement on it. So I do think it's very important and that it should be broad, but also have enough specificity to mean something. Jennifer?
Great. I love all of that. I'm all for, I love it. I love all of it. I'm wondering, bringing it back to the students, because we've had a number of students who've come to us over the years, really interested in all of this. Is there a way that we should be engaging with student groups around this and sort of engaging with them and mobilizing them and getting their feedback on the policy? We've done that a number of times over the years, invited groups to invite them for comment, or just, sending it out to student groups and saying, hey, we're working on this policy, you might be interested in it, or I don't even know if we've sent it out to like head of school and said, students may be interested in this. Do you want to, like, we've had it disseminated before in different formats. Do you remember in years past? We've done over time, we've done it. I don't know, Stephen's working with some, he had been sort of working with some student groups as well, around some sustainability work. I don't know, we've done that before and just said, hey, you might be interested in feedback, or just FYI. I don't know, might be worth thinking about reaching out and just letting people know that we're doing stuff, we're thinking about stuff, and you may want to know about the good work we're thinking about doing or engaging in. So, you know, I'm all for doing as much as we can, and including as much as we can. So I support it all.
I agree, Jennifer. I think also some of the middle school groups that we often don't hear from, but have active groups going, if we could get it to them as well.
Yeah, Driscoll's got an active group. I think Driscoll does. Pierce
Yes,
does. Lawrence
Driscoll
does.
definitely does. Yeah.
Yeah, Lawrence definitely does. They came LCAT. There's an LCAT group there. Pierce has a strong group. I mean, I'm sure the other groups, other schools do. I'm just off the top of my head. I know I know there's active groups there in the middle schools. So, you know, I think that we've had some really motivated student groups. We've heard from groups at the high school. There's been a lot of activity around, food services. There's been a lot of stuff going on around composting. A few years ago, before the pandemic, there were students who were really interested in gardening and sourcing food. Food waste was really active for a while, but the pandemic really impacted so many things negatively. So I think there's a lot of student motivation around this issue. We've heard about students before the pandemic coming to public comment and being really motivated around education and being educated about climate change. And so, I think students would be interested and may have some input about what's really important to them as well.
And in fact, at one of the last Mothers Out Front events, Driscoll students spoke at that event from the Keep Club on the gas leaks, and I was really impressed with a lot of the 6th and 7th graders who spoke at that event. So there has been collaboration with Wendy as well.
I would also add to the point about student engagement, which I certainly agree with. We should circulate this draft with many more students and student groups. We did have a student who crafted the food services paragraph, and most of it is verbatim what he wanted in the policy. So I'm very happy with that we have, it's very direct input from students, and we should continue to do more of that. Suzanne?
A couple of things. Stephen Ehrenberg is interested in kind of being our sustainability guru here. So I would certainly welcome his input on this. And the other thing to mention is in some of these details, they are coming up at town meeting. As we know, we just had the big discussion about artificial turf. So, we need to keep our eyes on what is happening in town meeting. Certainly if town meeting votes for some of these warrant articles that would promote what Wendy has suggested in her statement, that would then become part of our policy. So, there's lots going on. We are not pushing the leadership here, actually. And, we can have a long discussion, but we already had that. So things will change, and we just need to be on top of it and to be responsive to that. I'm thinking about single-use bottle, single bottle use. How do we say that? You know what I mean?
And plastics, I think.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things coming up. And so at some point, if they pass, they would be part of our policy, I would guess. If they don't pass and it's in our policy, then I'm not sure what that means. Again, we could be the leaders, but, we had the one vote, as I said. So anyway, it's quite complicated, actually, but needs to be thought through.
Right, to your point, Suzanne, that there's a lot pending regarding natural surfaces and synthetic surfaces. Right now, that was the main reason why I'm sort of hedging in the schoolyard section in this draft, because we don't know the outcome of that. And so I want to be careful about taking the position of one side that might at town meeting end up losing, and we don't really know yet. So this may need to be amended depending on what happens at town meeting. Any other thoughts? Jennifer?
I would just say that I think one of the coolest things is that our students are some of our best leaders. If we think about what's happened over the last few years, when we think about composting, when we think about some of the stuff that's even come up and gone through what's happened at the town level, when we think about oh God, I'm trying to think of what the language we used that we finally came up with, but feminine products being available for free and across the town. That started with students. Composting products. Composting came up from the schools, and now it's more prevalent. I mean, that was with support actually from a lot of people who came and supported us, or others out front. We had some volunteers. So just really cool stuff came from a lot of student advocacy. So I'm just really excited about the stuff that our students bring up and support us with. And we need them to help us with Meatless Mondays and the food service stuff that's happening. Because if they don't come and support us by eating what's there, then we're not going to be able to continue to provide it. So we need their advocacy and their support to make it a reality. So that's why I think it's really important to keep them engaged in this policy process, because that's the implementation is what's going to carry the policy. So I'm super proud of them, and we totally need them to be our partners as well, because they're going to lead the future. So awesome. Thanks, Wendy, for coming and for helping us.
Yes, thank you. Any other thoughts on this agenda item? All right, seeing none, we'll move on to the next one, which is discussion of town meeting warrant articles. Now, we have already voted on the warrant articles that we had a public hearing for at full school committee, with the exception of Article 8, which is the budget appropriation. I expect that we'll have more information regarding what the specifics of that budget will be within the next couple of weeks, possibly even by our meeting on April 27th. So I don't have anything further to add to that. Regarding the position statements for the warrant articles that we already voted on, one of those is going to be a little difficult to write because of how divided the vote was, but I'll try to present it in as balanced a way. And of course, all committee members will have an opportunity to look that over. That may need to be something that we docket for the full school committee, so that we can have a discussion about whether the statements are approved. Because this time, rather than in contrast to some of our other recent town meeting warrant article votes and statements, we had some more division than usual. Does anyone have thoughts on town meeting warrant articles or position statements? No? Okay. So next up is discussion of collaboration with the equity subcommittee. I put this on because I'm thinking about the future of the equity policy draft, where we have a very bare bones skeletal initial draft that hasn't been worked on or updated in a couple months now. And I'm wondering, Val, whether you as chair of the equity subcommittee would like to take that up in your meeting. And if you could also just tell us and the public about where the equity subcommittee currently stands and what your vision is for it.
Sure. So currently we are doing community conversations, having lots of community conversations and inviting dialogue into what the community would like to see. I'm going to be meeting with Janae to make sure that we're aligned on goals of the district, and that we're taking on pieces in a way that can be achieved and that are sort of bite-sized for on an annual basis for the committee. We are looking at either the end of April, although that looks less likely because we really do want a lot of community input before we move forward on an early May 1st meeting. Be happy to take on the equity policy. We've been talking to a lot of students in the BIPOC community. We're setting up meetings with AAPI students and families, LGBTQ+, disability community, among others, and including adults with students in the school system, without. We've met with the Metco PTO chair, and we'll meet again on that and are looking at sort of the legality. Suzanne had asked me as one of our first orders of business to look at what scenarios could be for either a Metco liaison or a non-voting school committee member. And first step really is whether there's appetite for it from the Metco families, and so that's where that is right now. And I've also looked at a couple of other towns that have non-voting school committee members who are Metco parents. So lots more conversation, and we'll be working with Janae and team on some measures for accountability that are measurable and achievable, and have a lot of community engagement opportunity at the meetings.
Thank you for that.
And I'm
update.
happy to take on the policy, David, if you want to kick it over.
Okay. All right, that brings us to new business. And in the context of new business, I do see that we have a couple of attendees. And I'm not sure if you wanted to comment on one of our earlier agenda items, or if you have new business on your mind. I always like to let the public participate. So please raise your virtual hand if you would like to address the policy subcommittee. And in the meantime, do school committee members have any new business? All right, seeing none. Last chance. Attendees, do you have anything you'd like to address to the subcommittee? All right, I guess not. You're always welcome to send written comments to any of us or participate at our next subcommittee meeting. So thank you everyone for participating tonight. We're actually finishing early. Very pleasantly surprised by that. So enjoy the rest of your evening, and many of you I'm going to be seeing later at a subsequent meeting. All right, bye.